You wanted the best. You've got the best podcast. The hottest podcast in the world. The Chris Voss Show, the preeminent podcast with guests so smart you may experience serious brain bleed. The CEOs, authors, thought leaders, visionaries, and motivators. Get ready. Strap yourself in. Keep your hands, arms, and legs inside the vehicle at all times, because you're about to go on a monster education roller coaster with your brain. Now, here's your host, Chris Voss.
Folks, Voss here from thechrisvossshow.com. Ladies and gentlemen, the Iron Lady sings, that makes it official. Welcome to the big show. As always, for 16 years, 2,800 episodes, we bring you one of the oldest handful of podcasts. They're still alive and kicking and regularly broadcasting all these years later. Be sure to refer the show to your family, friends, and relatives. Help us keep it going there with the pirate ship. Go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss, LinkedIn.com/Chris Voss, Chris Voss one, the TikTokity, and all those crazy places on the internet. Today we have an amazing young man on the show. We're going to be talking about his new book that's going to be insightful and probably topical given the topics of the Iran war that we have going on today. His book is entitled The Fixer, A Journalist's Accidental Journey Through the Middle East by Amjad Tadros. We're going to get into it with him, find out some of his history and experience. He is an award-winning investigative journalist and media entrepreneur with more than 3 decades of leadership in journalism, digital media, and communications. As a CBS News Middle East producer from 1990 to 2023, he managed regional coverage of transformational events, including Iraq wars, the September 11 hijackers' backstories, the Arab Spring, Syria's chemical attacks on civilians. His commitment to the truth earned him 4 Emmy Awards, including stories about Syria's chemical gas attacks and white helmets, and a 2008 Peabody Award and 2 Alfred L. DuPont Awards from Columbia Journalism School. In 2013, he co-founded Syria Direct, an independent media organization empowering young Syrians to deliver impartial news about their country's conflicts. Publishing in Arabic and English, it reaches audiences in Syria, the Syrian diaspora, diplomats, and scholars. It also serves as a resource for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees Commission on Inquiry on Syria. Syria Direct earned the 2017 McNulty Prize and the 2019 Migration Media Award and the 2020 Free Press Unlimited Syria Co-Production Fund Prize for its impactful journalism. He's now retired from CBS News. Tadros focuses on strategy media initiatives and governance while managing his family's jewel date farm. Exporting premium dates globally. Welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having you. When I read that CBS Middle East producer, that kind of breaks my heart for seeing what's going on with CBS these days. Give us your .coms. Where can people find you on the interweb, sir?
It breaks my heart too as well. So see what's going on.
Oh, yeah.
Actually, one of the reasons that made me finish the book at the end was, seeing what's happening with the media in the U.S., particularly with CBS News, and, all the accusation that has been piled on us, calling us, like legacy media and fake news and all of these things.
It's crazy.
So I thought it would be really fair for me to write, in my experience and what I have seen over the past 3 decades, and all the hard work that was put in by many of my colleagues. Oh, yeah. And some of us, actually, some of them lost their lives covering the news and then in their pursuit to find the truth. And now when we are being accused like this, it's really heartbreaking and sad.
It is definitely heartbreaking. I grew up watching Walter Cronkite and CBS Sports, CBS News. I mean, there was a place that you went to was Howard Cosell, was that on CBS News or was that ABC? Maybe I'm thinking ABC. But, there were 3 major channels and, you had respectable people you could trust. And I think a lot of it's still the same way, but, we see what Larry Ellison's doing. Anyway, let's get into your book and give us your .coms and where you want people to find you on the interwebs.
My book is now available on sale on Amazon, and they can go on my website, which is amjadtadros.com, and it has all the information about the book and what's inside it and how you can find it.
So give us a 30,000 overview, if you would, of what's inside the book.
The book is basically, it's a collection of stories and anecdotes drawn from my experience over 33 years working for CBS News in the Middle East. I was fortunate enough to have a front row seat of events in the region, particularly in Iraq from 1990 to 2006. And I also covered, a lot of regions in the Middle East like Yemen, Syria, Egypt, and the Gulf countries. And, I started my career by accident, and that's because I was supposed to be a mechanical engineer.
Oh, really?
I went to school in the UK to study mechanical engineering. And I came back to Jordan in 1990 on my way to go to get some work in Saudi Arabia to work for Procter & Gamble. I don't know if you know the company.
Yeah.
And then at that time, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. I end up with no job.
Oh, really?
So by chance, a friend of mine told me about some American people in Amman looking for some people to help them.
Uh-huh.
So I went, and I didn't know what I was expecting, And they looked at me and they asked me, "Do you speak English?" And I said, "Excuse me, yes, I do speak English. I'm a British graduate." And said, "Okay, you're hired." So they sent me out for the day to cover the news with some, television crew. I had no idea what I was in for. I didn't even know what television news is all about.
Wow.
And when I got back, the producer asked people with me, said, how did he do? They said, "Oh, he's very good." So the producer told me, "Okay, come back tomorrow." And I came back for the next 33 years after.
Wow.
So that's how I got into the news business.
That is a wild ride.
Absolutely.
I mean, necessity negates what. There's a saying. I'm a little bit under the weather, as you. I think you are sick too. We're two sick people doing a podcast right now. But necessity. Something about crisis. Brings sometimes the best thing. So getting fired may have been the best thing for you, or laid off.
Yes, I mean, basically, this is how I got into it. It was by pure accident. But also later on, 3 years later, in 1993, I was in Iraq with the CBS News crew, and I got hit. The hotel where I was staying was hit by an American cruise missile.
Oh, wow.
And I was injured in the attack.
Oh, no.
Yes, I was in a hotel room, and the Tomahawk cruise missile hit the hotel where I was staying. And I ended up in a hospital bed in Baghdad on my own, wearing a T-shirt and underwear and guess who came to visit me in hospital bed? It was Saddam Hussein himself. And, seriously, yes. And that was again, it was a very traumatizing experience, a bit scary.
Yeah.
But as a result of that, when Saddam showed up, of course, he doesn't show up alone. He came with a whole entourage of cameramen and cameras. And excuse me. And then they end up, Saddam and I end up having a picture. So I had a picture of me and Saddam in the hospital bed. That was in the newspapers and all over the place. And after that, every January 17th, which was the anniversary of the war, Saddam used to send me a gift.
Really?
Yes. So I kept getting gifts for all those years till 2003 when the regime collapsed.
Oh.
Okay,
wow.
But you have to understand one thing. Iraq was a police state. And what the police state means is that, there's a huge amount of fear between the people. Everybody is worried about everybody else. And the fact that I had this picture of Saddam and people thought that I was, somehow important because I have this picture with him. And I used to get this gift every year. So everybody at the Ministry of Information where we used to work in Iraq, used to be afraid of me. They thought I knew somebody or I was important. And I wasn't important at all. I just met Saddam for 2 minutes and by absolute chance. But that allowed me and my team at CBS to work in Iraq for all those years unchallenged because the Iraqis did not want to bother me because they were afraid that I was, that if they talked to me...
You might be good buds with the Saddam there.
That I was a friend of Saddam Hussein, which I wasn't. I wasn't even a fan of Saddam.
Yeah.
But that allowed me to work there. And that allowed us to do very, very important stories in Iraq. And we won many, many awards. And a lot of those stories are mentioned in the book. I mean, I can tell you some of them.
Sure.
And in fact, one of the stories, our first Emmy that I won, was a story we did about a missing American pilot in Iraq by the name of Michael Scott Spiker. Spiker, was shot. His plane was shot down on January 17th, 1991. The first day of the first Gulf War, and when he landed, he was declared killed in action because they couldn't find him, and his wingman said that his plane exploded in the sky. At that time, an Iraqi pilot shows up in Iraq, and he told his commanders that he shot down an American plane. And everybody laughed at him. They said, "You cannot do that. How can you shoot down an American plane?" And that plane went, nobody knew, and Spiker was declared killed in action. Around 1994, 95, some Qatari prince goes hunting in the desert of Iraq, and there he found this American F-18 plane in the desert, in the middle of the desert.
Oh.
Of course, he takes some parts of the plane, and he goes back to Qatar, and the Americans were told about this plane in the desert. Of course, the Americans knew about the plane, but didn't know where it was exactly. And then they decided to go through the Red Cross and go and find the wreckage of the plane in Iraq, hoping to find the body of the pilot. Mm-hmm. And they went there, and they discovered a few interesting things, that the ejection seat was 4 miles away from the crash site. And they found out that the flares that the pilots are given were fired, which meant that he landed alive.
Oh, wow.
And that brings us to to what happened, a few weeks ago with the American pilots in Iran. Yeah. Because all the American pilots, are given what's called beacons and are actually strapped to their suits. And once they land, they give signals so we'll be able to find them. And the U.S. Navy and the Air Force always tell the pilots, no matter what, we're going to get you and we will find you.
Yeah.
With Spiker, that didn't happen. And that created some embarrassment inside the establishment, because how come you didn't find them? And apparently what happened then, just before the first Gulf War, the pilots were issued new beacons that did not really fit in their pockets. So some of the pilots that ejected in Iraq, when they landed, they found out that the beacons, were lost in the ejection.
Oh.
So that was Spiker's story. Anyway, so we went to Iraq, and we had to convince the Iraqis to take us to the desert. And we went there, and we found the plane, the wreckage of the plane in the middle of the desert. And we did a story about it. And we interviewed the Iraqi pilot who claimed that he shot him and that no one believed him. And that was the start of a very interesting story about the hunt of what happened to Michael Scott Spiker, which is, and that is a result of our story. At that time, President Clinton went to the UN, and they changed his status from killed in action to missing in action. Imagine, the guy was declared dead and then he was found alive. I mean, I described the whole story and how at some point an Iraqi defector came to Jordan, and he claimed that Saddam Hussein's son has an Iraqi pilot, an American pilot in prison. And when he was shown pictures of different pilots, he actually pointed to the right picture. So the Americans thought that the Iraqis had him. Of course, it wasn't true. And there were lots of twists and turns in the story. And at the end, many, many years later, part of his body was found in Iraq, and he was, taken back to the United States and buried. So it is a very interesting story about Spiker. And that's one of the stories that without my connections in Iraq and without the Iraqis trusting me, nobody could have uncovered the story.
That's wild, man. And that's an example of where great journalism helps solve these mysteries that sometimes even our own government overlooks.
Yeah, I mean, journalists, our main task in life basically is to try to find out the truth, no matter how hard the truth is. And sometimes, it takes time. You have to be persistent. And years, some of those stories take years to uncover. You cannot do the story in 5 minutes or in a 2-minute, or 1 minute 30 report or an Instagram reel, and at that time, CBS News and 60 Minutes had the time and the resources to commit to those stories. Yeah. And this is why you get, we used to do very, very good television. Another story that I did, which also mentioned in the book, about a story about a guy called Curveball. And who was Curveball? Curveball was an Iraqi defector who showed up in Germany and claimed that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. And he told the Germans about biological weapons factory in the south of Baghdad that he claimed was working there. And when he was asked to show them where the factory is, he actually started to describe the factory, and he drew these what's called the mobile trucks that at that time in 2003, Secretary of State Colin Powell took to the United Nations and they showed them at the UN and they showed that we have evidence that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. And on that testimony, the US went to war in 2003.
Jesus. Wow.
Believe it or not, the Americans did not meet curveball before the war. They did, all the information that they had, they got it through the German intelligence.
Wow.
And to be fair, he told them a story that is kind of believable. Okay, It wasn't very wild, except that it took me 5 minutes to find out that the guy is basically a pathological liar. When I found him. And there were many spies who worked with the Americans who told them that there were no weapons of mass destruction. But they decided to believe one guy that they didn't meet. So after the war, I was commissioned to find him. It took me 4 years traveling.
4 years?
4 years traveling to 7 countries to nail him down. And I found him in the end. And we put him on television and we showed how ridiculous this guy is. And not only that, how ridiculous that anybody could have believed him and took the whole, country to a war, in Iraq that was devastating to, not just to Iraq, but to America itself. To America's, still many people talk about, the whole idea of Iraq and how the failure of the U.S. invasion of Iraq and what happened after that.
Yeah.
But again, that took 4 years to do the story. And this is why, this news organization, when you had the commitment from the management and the resources to do it, we could do these stories. So these are the very 2 important stories we did in Iraq, basically. And they came because, I was, in the middle of this whole thing. I was so privileged to have a front row seat.
Yeah, you kind of almost have to pinch yourself, the run-in or the photo op or whatever with Saddam Hussein gives you this wonderful, incredible access. Both languages, so you can talk it. I was just noticing here, your Dan Rather gave you a glowing review on the book. I mean, I grew up watching Dan Rather, I think, out in the weeds in Vietnam. I remember him.
I worked a lot with Dan Rather, and I was with him in 2003, just after the U.S. Army rolled into Baghdad. We actually drove from Amman to Baghdad on a very, very, very dangerous trip, and we got shot at on the way, and we got to Baghdad just a day after the U.S. Army moved in. And it was the commitment from Dan Rather. God bless him. He wanted to be there, and he kept telling me, Amjad, we have to go there. We have to be there. We cannot let history past us. And again, we were in extreme danger. And later, some of our colleagues were killed. I had in car bombs, they were shot at, some were kidnapped. And, my book tells a very, very sad story at the end, actually, of all of these events. But I wanted to also tell the world that, we were committed to finding the truth. We put in a huge amount of resources at a great danger. I always tell my friends, when I used to go back home after I do all the stories, I would never tell my mother what I have done, because she would not let me out. She would never let me out of the house after that.
Yeah, so much danger.
Yes, but also, and we did other stories. And one of the other story I did also, which was in a way done by chance, I was in Yemen at some point, and by accident, I bumped into a guy, and he turns out to be Osama bin Laden's bodyguard. And imagine, his name is Nasser al-Bahri, a.k.a. Abu Jandal. And, he was my age, and we kind of, became friends. And I used to take him every day to Kentucky Fried Chicken. He used to love to eat Kentucky Fried Chicken. And he would tell me all these stories about him. And then at the end, we put him on television. And that story was very, very interesting, because for the first time, we showed a terrorist as a human being. We showed him with his family and his children. And he's not, because usually when you see terrorists on television, they are usually carrying guns and shouting and screaming in foreign languages. So this is the first time we actually showed somebody as a human. And again, I don't sympathize with what he did, but I try to explain in the book about the background and the context about why this guy became who he is and what would have happened if he was raised in different environment. This guy, if he was raised, for example, in New York, he could have been a taxi driver or a bank manager or a teacher. But the fact that he grew up in a very unprivileged circumstances led him to become whoever he was, And so I try always to explain the context. The book was written primarily to an American audience to understand what the Arab world is all about, in the hope they would understand who we are and that we can prevent these problems in the future.
Yeah.
When I was writing the book, my 6-year-old niece looked at me and she said, "Uncle, what is your book about?" And I thought about it and I told her, "I think my book is about war." And I tried to describe war in the book. And war is a very, very horrible thing. And, you can never underestimate what the war does. In fact, the first line of my book, I'm going to read it to you. I borrowed a poem from the early Arabic history that says, "War is only what you have known and tasted. No narrative can describe it as well." Even with a book like mine, I cannot describe war to you and how horrible war is. And war never ends because it doesn't end by the time that, the guns stop shooting. War creates orphans, it creates poverty, it creates depression. It is just so ugly. And I have seen so many of these wars that I always wonder why people just keep going to war. And now, what's happening in Iran, it's breaking my heart again. I can see the Iraqi scenario being repeated again and again with no end in sight. Okay, who do you blame? Do you blame the Iranians? Probably. Do you blame the Americans? Probably. Do you blame the Israelis? Probably. There's blame that goes around for everybody. But there's always, I believe, another way that we could have avoided this crisis. Like the first day of the war in Iran, a school was hit. 184 school children were killed, girls.
Yeah.
Can you imagine how many mothers are weeping? It's so sad.
It's generational trauma and damage, I would say, maybe.
And it is not going to finish because those people, their families, their brothers, their fathers, they're going to live for the rest of their life asking for vengeance. And it's going, it will put us in a cycle of violence and counter-violence that never ends. There's, you cannot come and, change the regime in a country with the aerial bombing. It didn't happen. The Americans tried to change the regime in Iraq in 2003. And look what we got. Iraq is not stable till today. They tried it in Libya, by the way, and Libya is not stable. The fact that, I think war is like the most horrible way of resolving problems. They always could have, people can always find another way of doing it.
Yeah. There's always a way to diplomatically do it. Yeah. The one thing I always say, this is my quote, the one thing man can learn from history is that man never learns from his history. And thereby we go round and round. And it's just wild to live right now because you're just like, didn't we do this in the 90s and didn't work out well?
Yes, exactly. And I was also one of the things I have done. I was part of a team that we tried to uncover the roots of the 9/11 hijackers. Traveled the world, looking for their families and friends and where they came from, and how this whole thing was hatched. The whole 9/11 plot was done. It was done in Germany, by the way, and people don't know that. It was, it started in Hamburg. In Germany by a group of enthusiastic young men who got together somehow and they were recruited and they wanted to do something, I don't know why. And they ended up being taken to Afghanistan where they met a guy called Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, KSM, and this guy is in Guantanamo Bay. And he thought that he could use them to go into the United States and actually fly the planes. Because, they all had, German German papers and so on. It was easier for them to get them to the United States. And this is what was all hatched. And if you look at them, where they came from, each came from a very depressed or interesting, situation that they were easily recruited. And even the 16 hijackers that were later recruited, these are what they call the foot soldiers, the people who were taken from Saudi Arabia to go to the United States, and they were supposed to be the guards on the plane, not the pilots. Oh. There were 16 of them. These were recruited in Saudi Arabia. Actually, only 15 showed up. One of them didn't show up. And those 15, they didn't know what they were doing. They were told that they were going to hijack the planes. They didn't even know the exact details of the whole plan. Some of them were brothers, and they come from this village in the southern Saudi Arabia, where we went and saw the village. And if you see this village, the poverty, the depression there is just enormous. That makes it so easy for anybody to go and recruit, young men to do, awful stuff.
Yeah.
And if you don't go and solve these problems from the root causes, you're always going to get, people who are willing to go and kill themselves.
Yeah.
To do these things. So
I mean, they don't have anything to lose, really.
Excuse me?
They don't really have anything to lose other than their life, and when your life's that miserable.
Yeah, exactly. When you have, people who are deprived, and especially now with the advent of social media and communications, people start comparing, because in the past you live somewhere and you don't know what's happening somewhere else. Now people kind of know, and when you start comparing, you feel sorry for yourself. And it's become so easy to find those people and recruit them. And again, this is why I wrote the book. I really hope that people can read the book and learn something from it. Because I can see, history keeps repeating itself. And somebody has to put an end to the cycle.
Yeah, we need to learn from our history. Yeah. I noticed Clarissa Ward also gave you a beautiful recommend on the book. She's been on the show. We profiled her on her memoir and her stories in Iraq. And, we were talking earlier about how you got a lot of access by having that photo with Saddam Hussein. Of course, you can speak the language in those parts, so you can fit in. One of the things that was interesting about Clarissa Ward was, I was like, you're this tall, blonde, very white, bright white woman in Iraq, and she's trying to, infiltrate, and be kind of anonymous and in there. And I'm like, that's got to be kind of challenging. But I must say, I have a biased opinion of Clarissa Ward. She's a good friend of mine. She's, one of the great reporters I've worked with. Yeah.
And Clarissa Ward speaks like 6 languages, by the way.
I think so.
She's fluent in Arabic.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, she has been, the subject of a lot of attacks by different people because of her bold reporting.
Yeah.
Especially after she moved from CBS News to CNN.
Yeah.
And I always tell people, Clarissa Ward, knows the Arab world. She knows us well. And whenever she's reporting about us, she's actually reporting from her heart, because she lived in Beirut for a year and she knows the Arabs. And I'm saying she's sympathetic to us, but at least she understands where we come from.
Yeah.
She is more like a local reporter than Yeah. And I have the highest respect for her. She's one of the best reporters I worked with, actually.
Yeah.
And very bold, and actually.
Yeah, she does great. She gives great coverage, and she's always in some place where I'm like, "Girl, where are you at, man? You should be there." Whether it's Ukraine or
my opinion about Clarissa is very biased, because I went with her to Yemen at some point, and we were standing in a hospital, and in the courtyard of the hospital, and as we were standing, an air raid happened. A Saudi air raid happened just a couple of miles away. You could see planes bombing, and it's freaking. And Clarissa was just stood there, and she banged, a 10-second, stand up in front of the camera with the planes at the back. I mean, that takes guts.
It does.
Yes,
it does.
Absolutely. But on the flip side, at that point, we were taken to see the president of Yemen. Yemen has a Houthi president called Abu Ahmed, very colorful character. that, he was just put there. So they took us to meet him at the presidential palace in Sana'a with Clarissa. And of course, he was totally starstruck by her because, he saw this blonde American woman in front of him. And the guy, I was sitting inside the palace, insisted that we cannot leave without having lunch. And so they dragged us into this room, it's a very elaborate dining room, and they brought this lunch, and he wouldn't let us leave. And as we were having lunch, we could hear Saudi planes flying on top of the palace. And I was so freaked out, like, guys, we're going to be bombed. And said, oh, don't worry, that happens every day. Like, guys, we're sitting in the presidential palace, and the planes are above us. And the guys wouldn't let us leave because he was so happy to have Clarissa Ward as a guest. And the story is also in the book, actually, with the pictures of Clarissa having lunch.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah. There are 3 chapters about Yemen, by the way, in the book. And Yemen is one of my favorite countries. And it's one of the saddest countries in the world. It's a country of 35 million people who are being ignored. Nobody cares about Yemen or what happens to Yemen. And I always tell people, in fact, the chapter about Yemen in the book is called Yemen is Important. And why is Yemen is important? Because every time you go on an airplane, they take away your water bottle from you. I don't know if you know that.
No.
And why do they take your water bottle away from you? Because somebody in Yemen a few years ago came up with this idea of mixing chemicals in on an airplane and creating a bomb, and came up from Yemen. The shoe bomber, I don't know if you remember him, came.
Yeah, I remember him. Yeah.
And then some other guy came up with this idea to put explosives in the love handles of some people and put them in airplanes. And they discovered that this is when they introduced the body scanners at airports. Yeah. Now when you go in and they put in a body scanner, that is because of Yemen. And when people say we don't care about Yemen, no, we do care about Yemen. Because look what Yemen has exported to us, including coffee too, by the way. And, so people have to understand where these things came from and why are they there, and try to do something about it. Instead, Yemen is absolutely ignored. There's massive amount of poverty and hunger and so on, and no one cares,
What is your opinion on why, somebody wrote a great book called The Death of Expertise, and certainly bloggers impacted real journalistic news that held to journalistic standards and kind of created this world that we have now where everyone's a news brand, everyone has opinion, whatever. There's kind of that joke on Facebook that this week everyone's an Iran expert, next week they'll be an expert in shipping or something, oil. And there's so much noise and so much quackery of fake journals, people that aren't even journalists. They're just an idiot with a mic and a camera, and they've diluted the value and quality in a bunch of idiocracy minds that that somehow that journalism is better when it's not.
Okay, this is what's called citizen journalism. In fact, I wrote about it in the Syria chapter in my book. And because what happened in Syria was very unique. When the problem happened in Syria, I think started in 2011, the government of Syria did not allow journalists to come in except very, very few selected. And the other option was for journalists to come in from the north through the opposition. Okay, at some point, Al-Qaeda and ISIS and so on started to kidnap those journalists and sell them.
Yeah,
and so it became very, very dangerous. Very few foreign journalists actually went into Syria. Okay, either from the north or through the government. Clarissa Ward was actually one of the first few people who went in, but that was before things got ugly.
Yeah.
So what happened at that time? Mobile phones started to spread. And, with their cameras. And that created what we call citizen journalists, who are people with mobile phones taking pictures and videos and putting them online. Okay, and then they started to have likes and followers and so on. And some of them actually got a lot of followers. And I always describe them, and I have the highest respect for them, and many of them actually lost their lives doing what they did. But I always divide them into 3 categories. They are either, they are mercenaries, missionaries, or misfits. which means, okay, either they are mercenaries that somebody paid them to do or say whatever they do. Yes. Or they are missionaries that they have a mission to do it. They have, something to tell you, okay, because they believe in something. Or they are misfits, just people, who would like to get more likes and followers on Facebook and Twitter and what have you. Okay. They formed a very important role in the coverage. Usually they don't give you the context. So they always need an interpreter. So when we set up Syria Direct in Jordan, to cover the news about Syria, we used a lot of those people. But what we did, you always have to gather all this information and verify it and collaborate it together and produce something that has context. That will, and take the noise out. And the problem with those people, they create a lot of noise. And sometimes, it is counterproductive. There's also another story in the book about the White Helmets. The White Helmets were a group of the civil, the first aid, first responders in Syria. And they started, some of them were civil defense people and so on, and they organized themselves and they got some money from the opposition and from a lot of foreign donors to do whatever they were doing. And they actually did a lot of good work. They would used to go into the buildings and try to help the people, after the bombings and so on, and they saved a lot of lives.
Yeah.
But at some point, because, all the foreign governments had very little that they could do about Syria, and they looked very, very idle. So they start giving a lot of money to those people, and they gave money to the White Helmets, and they bought them a lot of equipment, and they gave them a lot of media training. And part of the media training was that they bought them GoPros, those cameras that they put in their house, and they taught them how to film and report, in a very professional manner. So the coverage that started to come up from the White Helmets after that became very real. Became very good quality instead of a shaky video and, and so on. And that allowed the regime at that point to accuse those White Helmets that of being fake. They said that those videos are produced in Hollywood. Look how good they are. How good those people. Wow. So the fact that they start producing good quality video, made them prone to, being accused of being fake. Wow. And so, yes, media is a very, very interesting thing. And the Syrian conflict, was a very, very good example of how media, the new media, is working now. And also it created the havoc. If you look at what happened in Syria, it's a disaster by any stretch. Millions of people were displaced, and I don't know how many million people were killed. Yeah, and I don't want to blame, the citizen journalists, but, they played a part in that. Also, the traditional media also played another part, but again, they created this havoc that people just felt lost.
Yeah, and here in America, they always bash. You mentioned at the beginning of the show, they bash legacy media, they bash mainstream media. I love it when Fox News, which used to be, I don't know if they still are, but they were like the cable #1 news network at one time, and they would bash mainstream media, and you'd be like, "Wait, aren't you #1 on the?" It's kind of, anytime I hear somebody bashing mainstream media, I'm like, you just want to be them. That's really what this is about.
What happened in the media, I started in media in 1990, so I've seen a lot of changes.
Oh, yeah.
At the beginning, it was very difficult to go and produce television because it was very expensive and the equipment was heavy and big, and you need to, get, tons of equipment to do satellite transmission and so on. It wasn't easy. But it meant that, it took us time to get there and gave us the time to think about what we're doing. It wasn't on the spot thing. So the news reports that we used to produce, came after a thought, they did not come on the spot. Okay, because, we had time to set up and so on. And by the time of the evening news happens, which is at the end of the day, you would have time to reflect on what you're doing. Later on, satellite, live TV came. And live TV, the emphasis in live television came on now that, we're reporting live from a place, reporting what? So what you end up seeing now a lot of reporters standing on rooftops and on top of buildings reporting the news. And what they are doing, they are interviewing other journalists. So they are talking to journalists without the context. So the emphasis became more important on where you are as opposed to what you're saying. And that, that came, when CNN came in and Fox News and MSNBC later. And then to add to that, then the social media came in. And it became a very interesting question. Now, okay, I'm standing on the street with my mobile phone. I see something happening in front of me. I film it. Is it my duty to just put it out on my Facebook account or my Twitter? Or is it possible for me to send it to my news organization and put it in a bigger context and try to explain what I have seen? And that is very, so the emphasis became on being out first. And, there was something that's called, have more news in less time. And, you can't explain the history of the Middle East in 1 minute 30 news piece. You can't. Okay. I mean, these are very ancient societies. There are a lot of history involved. And you cannot explain Iran, in a 1 minute 30.
Yeah.
What's going on in Iran. Iran is
this country's been around for 5,000 plus years, right?
Yeah, 90 million people is the size of Germany and France put together, And what people don't know about Iran, the reason we love Iran, not because of the weapons. Iranian is a very sophisticated society. The Iranian music, literature, art, the Iranian cuisine is the best. They have very good food. So you're talking about a country that has been there for a long time with a very rich history. Those mullahs are only been there for the last 47 years out of all of that. You cannot, cancel the whole history of a country by the fact that they were ruled by a bunch of mullahs for 47 years. It's a side note to the history of Iran.
Yeah, and this is why independent journalism is so important. And you guys adhere. You guys go to journalist school. You guys adhere to certain values. Most journalists we've ever on the show, from CNN, CBS, NBC, they carry around every day a copy of the Constitution with them, using in their pocket.
I tell you one thing. Journalists, if I accuse them of something, we usually give ourselves the moral high ground. We think that we know more or better than other people, which is not true. But at the same time, most of the people I worked with, especially with 60 Minutes people and people like Dan Rather and the producers we worked with, Bob Simon, they were people who believed in the mission. And our mission is tell the truth. You have to report whatever you have to see, what you see. In fact, one of the hardest stories we have done, it was the events at Abu Ghraib prison in Baghdad. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah, I do.
Yes, and that was a very, very hard story to report. It was done by Dan Rather at that time. I played a part in it, when we were in Iraq. Yeah. And unfortunately, that story, we uncovered a massive amount of whatever was happening inside the prison. But the effect of that on American, the propaganda that was used against America as a result of our story was so bad that after that, ISIS started to put their hostages in orange jumpsuit to emulate what was happening at Abu Ghraib. And so for me, somebody who worked on that story, I feel so bad that our story was so misused by all these terrorists and bad people. But what we did, we uncovered the story, and it was our job to do it. We had to cover that. We had to report it. You cannot keep it to yourself. Yeah. And sometimes it is hard. But what I was taught, you always have to report the truth, even if you don't like it.
Yeah.
And that is, it's so hard. But we learned it the hard way. And the worst kind of a story you do on television or actually newspaper is a story that you do to prove a point. Okay, we are not there to prove a point. That's not our job. We basically are the first draft of history. We tell people what we see and let other people make up their mind. It's not our job to tell people what to think. But people think that we should be that. We're not. We are, in fact, one of the best historians of the Arab world is called Professor Eugene Rogan at Oxford University. When he wrote a book about the events of Damascus in the 1800s, he used the notes from a guy called Ali al-Buderi, who was a barber in Damascus. And Ali al-Buderi, every night when he used to go home, he used to write down what people were saying at his barber shop. And he used it as the so to speak, the background of the book. This is all he got his information from the notes that Ali al-Budayri did. Okay, so when I met Professor Rogan, he told me who you are. I said, I am the barber. I just wrote what I saw. It is not my job to, I'm not a historian. I am just a storyteller. I tell you what I have seen, and other people can take it and write a second and a third draft of history. So we as reporters, we just have to report what we see, irrespectively if we like it or not, and other people can make up their mind. Unfortunately, some people, when we start getting opinionated as journalists, this is when we get into the, this is wrong. We should not have opinions. We should be, I was always told, we should be like the glass. We have to get the light through no matter what. We should not influence the events. In fact, it's very, very hard, for example, for us, when we used to go to refugee camps, for example. Us as journalists, we go there. Usually, we go there, we have money, we have water, we have food. And imagine when you go into a refugee camp and start distributing chocolate to children, you're going to create havoc in the camp that you'll not be able to cover. Okay, when you go and see somebody dying, is it our job to help them, or is it our job to film them? We are not UNICEF. We are not, an aid organization. So when we go to a place, sometimes it is, for us as journalists, it is seriously hard to stay away, not to get involved. We should never be part of the story. We should report the story. Because if we start getting involved and start saving lives and becoming, the Red Cross, we fail the mission that we are there for. I mean, the Red Cross should save people, not us. But we as a human, sometimes it is, you cannot not to do it. You have to, jump in and help, right? But as a journalist, you shouldn't. And it's so hard. So after you go home, when you finish, you sit at home and you thought of what you've done, and you become really, really sad of what you have seen, and the fact that we could not help.
Yeah, it's a war as hell, man. But we need good journalism. I remember the days of watching, like I say, growing up with Dan Rather, Walter Cronkite, the great CBS News back then, and I still follow Dan Rather to this day. I mean, since the first Trump administration, he's the one who helps keep me sane, and he has a voice of reason and regulation for emotional support.
And we have to hold the people in charge to what they say. You cannot, be, the biggest problem, for example, if you look at the Arab world, okay, is that, we don't have serious reporters. Many events go unnoticed, okay? And, in my book, there's a whole chapter that describes the Ministry of Information in Iraq during Saddam days. It is...
we had the audio feeds breaking up really bad. It's missing a lot of your words. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now, yes.
Okay, the reset. We missed all that you were replying to me on there.
Okay, there is a chapter in my book called "Reporting from the Belly of the Beast," and it was about how news was done in Iraq by the Iraqi government, and how Saddam tried to show himself to his people that he's strong and is this and is that, and so on, and how they formatted the news. But at the same time, the Iraqis never believed it, and look what happened to the country. Yes, you have for a journalist, credibility is your number one asset. If you lose your credibility, people stop believe what you say. You're useless. So I can go and start praising, X, Y, or Z, and justify their actions, and people will feel happy for the first 5 minutes. But then after that, when people discover the truth, and the truth will come out, in 1 day or 1 month or in 1 year. You look ridiculous, and people stop believing you. So they're going to go and start looking for somebody else. Yeah. So, to co-opt the media is not in the government interest at the end of the day.
Yeah. But we need great journalism. Thank you very much for coming on the show and sharing your stories. Give people your .coms as we go out so people can find you on the interweb, sir.
Okay. My website is amjadtadros.com. That's AMJADTADROS. The book is called The Fixer. It's available on Amazon and available in ebook, hard copy, and soft copy. And I hope people can buy it because it is written for an American audience who's interested in the media and the Middle East. And hopefully they would learn something out of it. It's quite a long book. It's 130,000 words, but it's made of little stories that are stitched together. And they are mostly very interesting and funny stories, but they tell a very, very sad story at the end. And I hope people enjoy it.
It's important we learn, too. The one thing man can learn from his history is that man never does. And we're seeing the remnants of this, of false flags and crazy stuff with the Iran war. Thank you very much for coming to the show, Jad. We really appreciate it. Thank you. And order up his book, folks, wherever fine books are sold. The Fixer, a journalist's accidental journey through the Middle East. Be sure to further show your family, friends, and relatives. Go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss, LinkedIn.com/Chris Voss, Facebook.com/Chris Voss, and YouTube.com/Chris Voss. Be good to each other. Stay safe. We'll see you next.
You've been listening to the most amazing, intelligent podcast ever made to improve your brain and your life. Warning, consuming too much of the Chris Voss Show podcast can lead to people thinking you're smarter, younger, and irresistible sexy. Consume in regularly moderated amounts. Consult a doctor for any resulting brain bleed.
All right, I'm John. We got that taken care of.